thank you very much to the conference for inviting me and for all of your time to listen to me talk about some of the work that I've done over the years. I need to update that link, but that link will take you to the current slides as well. So you should be able to access the slides through a Google Drive from that bit.ly link on the slide at the moment. But welcome to this talk about doing design research and user experience for human rights and humanitarian technology. The projects that I'm going to talk about within this talk and reference in this talk are in the areas of peace building or peace technology and security and privacy in high-risk human rights work. And I'm going to be talking quite a lot about high-risk people. If that's a term that people know, it can cover a lot of different kinds of users, but when I use the term high risk, we're typically talking about people that have a risk to their life in some way. So perhaps journalists, anybody fighting for human rights in countries or situations where their human rights are being suppressed or removed from them. So anybody that's in a intense situation globally. I'm going to talk about how we specifically mitigated traumatizing and re-traumatizing the people when I talk about the peace-building technology that I worked on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the processes that I go through when I'm working as a designer and a researcher on a piece of technology that high-risk users use. So two kind of different perspectives of the design process. One from a very focused on how we're building the technology kind of way and working with users in that way, and one from a more of a research angle with the peace building. I'll also talk a little bit maybe about cultural brokering, which is a term I don't know how common it is, but it's cultural brokering is when designers, researchers, or other people that have an understanding of a particular culture but may not be from that culture sit in with technologists that are building for those user cases. So we're there to do the cultural brokering so that it takes the pressure off of the traumatized users to explain everything to do with their complex situations. So that's what we refer to as cultural brokering or a brokering situation. But yeah, a few content warnings for this talk. There are some really difficult topics that I'm going to talk about. Some of them are listed at the moment on the slides, but I may mention other ones. Apologies, and thank you for your patience if I mention something which may trigger you. Please take care of yourselves if you need to remove yourself from the room or go somewhere else while I'm talking about these things. Your safety and comfort is way more important than you sitting and kind of suffering through a topic that is upsetting to you. But some of the topics are violence against women, protest scenarios, internet shutdowns, both from a governmental perspective and also from a kind of infrastructure failure perspective. So we can talk about internet shutdowns from a malicious entity has done this, and a crisis, a natural disaster has affected the infrastructure. Specifically, the Manchester Arena bombing, very briefly, which was a terrorist attack in the UK. Some terrorism, natural disasters, colonialization, racism, educational and social status prejudice, device seizure. So this is when a device is removed from somebody, or detained. Their device is detained and inspected, or maybe even tampered with in some way. And detainment of the individuals that are high risk. Some of the slides have no photos or copies, please. So don't take photos of those particular slides, but you can take pictures of the other slides. The reason being that the people that are in those slides have given me permission to use them in the slide content and video content, but not to go anywhere else through people taking photos. So thank you for limiting the passing of people's personal data. Pictures, mostly personal data. Okay, we'll rush through this quickly because you don't want to know too much about me. I've been doing this for actually 12 years now, over 10 years, so over 12 years I've been a designer of lots of different kinds of job titles. I do digital product design and UX mostly now. I've been doing design primarily and other things within open source software for about 6 years. I've been doing work, both paid and unpaid, within the human rights and humanitarian sector for around 9 years. And I've been at Superbloom for 2 years, but I've worked with them before then, voluntarily. And yes, somehow I'm also doing a PhD whilst working at the same time, looking at how designers are involved in open source software, but particularly humanitarian and human rights open source software. So I call myself a human rights-centered designer. It's a term which I don't know how common it is generally, but this is what it means to me. Is being a human rights-centered designer means that while you're centering the humans in your design, you also center both their unknown and sometimes their known digital privacy and security rights. So often the people that we work with that are high risk don't have the time, inclination, or need at the moment to read things like terms and conditions of software and how things are used, and they transfer a lot of sensitive data throughout these different software. So what we take on as a responsibility as human rights centered designers is centering those human rights within the technology that we design and build. So yeah, many people don't know their rights worldwide. One of the biggest examples of this at the moment is a lot of fingerprint identification tools that are used to distribute different aid in different countries. If you don't have official government ID, often a fingerprint is taken, and that's not really well understood by a lot of the communities that are digitally excluded. And they just hand over their fingerprint data because they want food and clothing and other things that they need. So as designers of those kinds of systems, we try and center their human rights within that process and not just capture their very important data because we want it. A little bit about Superbloom. So Superbloom, we're committed to changing who technology serves by leveraging design and design processes to shift power. We used to be called Simply Secure. We went through a rebranding process which was heavily influenced by open source processes. There's some blogs online if you're curious about how you do an open design brand change with the community. It takes a number of years, but it was an interesting and fulfilling process. But some of the things that we've worked on over the years as Superbloom, we've worked on a project to do with deceptive design, which is often more commonly known as dark patterns. Is that a more familiar term? We're trying to devalue the word dark patterns because of the connotation of dark and bad. So deceptive design is what we try and use now. So we worked with the Web Foundation on deceptive design. We did some really fantastic workshops with a lot of high-risk people, mostly high-risk people that get deplatformed from their essential platforms. So we're talking about human rights advocates, but also sex workers or people that maintain their income through semi-legal to illegal means using different platforms. So we did some fantastic workshops with how people get deplatformed and maliciously mobbed to be kind of reported, which was a really interesting to design patterns around those kinds of policies of reporting. We did a lot of we do a lot of resources. We did a set of resources for developers that work on high-risk security tools around how to do user testing and how to do the synthesis and all the different processes involved with doing user testing and why it's useful. We created the Dev's Guide 2. We did a pattern library for decentralized applications and software, which is the decentpatterns.xyz. And we did a toolkit for funders. We do a lot of work with funders as well, since our work is funded primarily through funders, non-profit funders, because we're an NGO at Superbloom. But that was how to help funders better understand how to fund critical digital infrastructure projects, which aren't just all about the technological infrastructure, but the usability of that infrastructure as well. So we were really helping funders better understand usability as a critical digital infrastructure. based off of, I don't know if people have read Nadia Egball's Roads and Bridges, fantastic book about the essential infrastructure of open source, if you're an open source nerd like me. But yes, some of the work I'm going to be talking about is Superbloom related, but also the peace building project is from when I worked at Ushahidi. Ushahidi is a Kenyan-based NGO that makes open source humanitarian technology, open source humanitarian data collection technology for human rights needs. They were founded in 2007, 2008, when Kenya was having their first democratic elections. And what they were seeing happen before the elections was a lot of people being stopped from accessing voting information, people being physically stopped from voting, voting booths being tampered in different locations. And a lot of this was tied to different kinds of tribal conflict that typically happens in Kenya. So they created Ushahidi's data collection platform, which was really for citizens to talk about what was happening in those locations at the time it was happening. Now Ushahidi is over 10 years old, so their tools have been used in lots of different cases, but often they get used in crisis response, citizen empowerment, lots of election monitoring across the globe, and lots of basically citizen-led human rights kind of call-outs or when human rights abuses are happening globally. This example on screen at the moment is from when Ushahidi's platform was used in Nepal when the earthquakes were happening. A lot of citizens coordinated a data collection response about what was happening in specific locations, especially rural locations that were hard to get to. And that information that citizens used an open source platform for was used by the Nepalese army to deploy helicopters to save people. So open source tools that are put into citizens' hands directly save lives in crises, which is fantastic to see. The two projects that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to briefly introduce both of them, and then I'm going to go into one and then the other. The first project was the project that I worked on at Ushahidi, which is called Izuku. Izuku is a Rwanda's national language word. It means fountain of peace. And Izuku was a project that was a consortium project, so a group, lots of different people and different organizations working on a project together, universities, software technology companies, exploring the potential of digital technologies to support peace through testing and development in Rwanda and Kenya. And this was a project that was done over the period of 3 years. You can find out more information at the URL there. Izuku, I don't think is a project that is maintained any longer. I think it's maintained as an academic project within the university, that it was one of the consortium universities. And the second project I'm going to talk about, which is the more on the technical side of thing, is a project by Least Authority, an organization called Least Authority called Destiny. Superbloom partnered with Least Authority to conduct essential user research on this tool with high-risk users like journalists and human rights activists in particularly hard-to-reach countries and communities and locations. Destiny is a magic wormhole application. Does anybody familiar with Magic Wormhole? I see, okay, cool, a couple of people. The last time I asked that, nobody was like, and then I got to explain Magic Wormholes. I learned for the first time about Magic Wormholes when I was working on this project. Essentially, it's a peer-to-peer connection through a different series of kind of code string information like words or letters, but it creates a direct link between those two devices, and it's often used by high-risk users to transfer really sensitive information. So basically, information that's illegal in the country that you are in. So it could be everything from like whistleblowing documents through to journalistic interviews, but it also can just be information that a lot of us in certain countries take for granted. So a lot of people in countries where LGBT identities are criminalized use this to share essential healthcare information and just essential community information as well. But I want to talk about Destiny a little bit first, and some of the learnings that I have from working on Destiny and doing this user research in this with these high-risk people. which is to never assume that your research participants know how to set up tools and packages, unless that is the process that you're researching. And then what I want to recommend to everybody here is that you take the labor out of the setup. So there is an example on the next slide, which is many people in the human rights community or the high-risk user category don't always access technology in the same way that other people, maybe like yourselves, would go to an app store, download an application. A lot of them have to go through a file, which is, you know, an APK for certain devices or other kinds of install files for other devices. So if you don't have those kinds of files available for the kinds of users that are going to use your tools for high-risk activities, then I would always recommend that you consider making those available somehow. So if a user can access your software at the moment through some kind of download process, if you're not making it also available in a way that is like an open source, or like if you are an open source tool as well, through a direct install file, then please consider doing so. If they know how to use it, it's a way that they can do that more securely, or even transfer those files through these kinds of systems as well to each other. A lot of people in certain communities, certain countries, don't have stable or reliable internet connections, so the way that they actually access essential tools like this is through USBs, sometimes still CDs, hard drives, and sometimes like mesh networks if they have access to different mesh networking devices. But just making these available is so critical to anybody that might use. You might think, my tool, nobody will ever use my tool or my service for human rights activity. You're probably going to be surprised at how often different tools are used for various high-risk activity. But one of the important things about Destiny through working with the users or doing the research with these users was about the importance of rapport building in the user research process, and how the important part of doing your pre-work before user research is about understanding cultural context and going through the processes of trying to understand what the culture of that person could be, essentially doing your homework. So before I speak with particular users from particular locations, I will do as much research generally on the web. I will look at different humanitarian reports that get published. One of my favorite is, I think, the GSMA. It's a mobile phone usage report that gets published every year, and it talks about the different uses of mobile technology around the world. But this helps you better understand the culture, and it helps you pick out clues when users talk about their daily lives. So the example that I wanted to give from the Destiny example was we were talking to a user that was based in Cameroon, and there were so many different cultural clues in this 1 hour, I think it was a 1.5 hour user research interview. But one of the specific cultural clues that we got was how they spoke very carefully and very candidly about authorities or different systems of authority, essentially the police force or different kinds of people that would stop them from doing what they're doing. So they had to be very careful within their user research. They couldn't just say, these people are seizing our devices. The way that they say those things are very, very careful and considered. So the better you understand how cultures talk about the people that might take their devices or might modify the software that they're using, which is your software, the better you can research that to then design against those kinds of risks for them. But this user also mentioned about the passing around of downloading updates. So a lot of us take for granted that we have reasonably safe, stable internet connections, and if we need to do an update on our devices, you press a button, update, it takes an amount of time. It's a bit of a pain, but it's there. But downloading updates in other locations is not as straightforward as having a stable connection or pressing a button. These people have to find the updates through some of these shared USB drives, CD drives, or they might have to find somebody that has access to something. And this is often shared around communities. And we were doing this user research around like how people access updates, and it was kind of taken for granted that people would be able to update, but we found out through the research that they update in a very different way. Also, when you have access to when you give users access to a file, which is downloading and install, make sure that there's very, very good documentation about how to install that as best you can on lots of different devices. We found that it was really difficult to help people across multiple different devices, especially as a lot of these high-risk people have multiple devices, because if they get seized, they will use a backup device, or they'll have a device that is specifically used for high-risk activity or particular high-risk activity. And so it was very different from one device to the next device how to install different versions of the software as well. So make sure that there's as much documentation about how to download and install the tool as possible on different devices. And the last thing that I want to talk about with Destiny is one of the things that I talk about a lot about when I talk about humanitarian work and human rights work is I'm not necessarily advocating that your own learning of or own experiences of those situations should replace partnering and working with the people in those locations. But that by learning and better understanding the cultural context, by experiencing some of those things firsthand, if you want to know how your tools are used in high-risk situations, it helps you better understand what to research more deeply, and it helps you engage in better rapport with the users as well. So don't take that learning as a replacement of people's lived experience and partnering with people, but know that if you're curious and want to partner with people to do research about your tools in specific high-risk countries or locations, that it may not be as easy for them to conduct that kind of research, even if it's just about the daily life and use of a particular tool. It might not be. It might take a certain amount of time longer, and certain aspects of doing user research are more difficult in different locations and scenarios. But yeah, putting yourself in a position of risk is also very tricky. I'm not necessarily advocating that everyone should put themselves in a protest scenario to know how that their tool may be used in a protest scenario, but it is useful and interesting if you are willing to take on that risk. It's certainly very useful and interesting to know what happens when the internet is shut down around a protest, if that is what happens in that country or that particular protest. But don't take your own comfort and safety for granted. The people that have to operate in those situations don't have that luxury of opting in to experiencing internet shutdowns because it's their daily life. So if you want to experience these things and how it affects your technology and your research, then go into it with your eyes wide open. Something that we use a lot in Superbloom is our persona non grata or adversarial personas. These are actually used quite a lot in different human rights organizations and NGOs globally. So these are some of the personas that we use when we're assessing how malicious activity could be done to a particular tool. So there's more information about our persona non grata and how to work with them on our website if you're curious about that, but these are just a selection of the different malicious adversarial personas that we model when we look at a particular tool's usage. Oh gosh, okay, time. I want to talk about working with trauma. This is from the Peace Building project in Ushahidi. So as a person that has their own experience of trauma, I was really interested and specifically focused on how to anticipate and prepare for traumatizing design activities, or when looking at how to build software with user communities. So I wanted to talk a bit more about one of the groups that we worked with specifically and tell you a story about what they told us, and then how I used that to better inform design activities that then led on to software prototyping. So one of the groups that we worked with was this group of women called Polycom Women. They're a group of women across many generations and backgrounds, dedicated to peace building in Kibera. Kibera is an informal settlement, or more commonly known as a slum, in Nairobi, capital city of Kenya. Kibera has a lot of different challenges and problems. It's got a lot of political problems, social problems, economic issues, and a lot of infrastructure, just like on the ground physical infrastructure. I think pre-pandemic they had their first official road built through Kibera, so that was their first official road that was built. But working with Polycom Women and the other attendees from the other organizations for this research project was one of the first times that I was very clearly confronted with my own experiences of trauma, but mine in relation to others when looking at how to design for high-risk traumatized users, and how to manage that within a research context, within a full sort of research planning context. So one of the activities that we needed to do, because it's a funded project which often you don't get to decide exactly what you have to do, but you can kind of find ways that are more empathetic around these when you're looking at funder-funded projects, was user journey mapping. I think maybe most people are familiar with the user journey mapping as a sort of concept or a tool. But we wanted to user journey map the experience of a crisis. So we asked people to user journey map their own crises. Some of the attendees were talking about when they were kidnapped, when they were robbed, when they were attacked because of their gender, tribal violence, which was something that was very new to me, and political violence. And one of the Polycom women spoke in great detail about a peaceful protest activity that ended in an injury when they were had stones thrown at them for being publicly outspoken as women. But some of the things that Polycom do as peace-building activity, just to give you a flavor of it, they will do things like, there's these public kind of areas which are kind of like squares, market squares, and they will, around times when there are maybe elections or anything that is politically contentious, they will go into these public areas and play football really badly on purpose. They're very good at football now because they've gone to play football badly on purpose multiple times. But the reason that they do that is because the youth in the area are often the people that get targeted and paid to incite violence, either set fires or to start trouble. And what these women do is go play football so that the young people are distracted and they're not bribed. Instead, they try and teach the women how to play football. And in that way, they then have conversations about peace and peace building. So a lot of their methods are really amazing, the way that they work with the community. So these are the kinds of things that they were doing in the journey mapping, and also like the outcomes of some of when that goes wrong. But I don't know about other people that have done journey mapping exercises here, but this is an example on the screen at the moment. It's got a familiar format with before, during, and after. But it was one of the first times that I'd seen on a journey mapping war, or the sound of bullets, or even kind of things like high food prices or not being able to get access to food. And I really struggled with a lot of this content in a way that I think a lot of people might struggle with this kind of content, whether you have personal experience of it or not. And this is an example from an internet shutdown protest. Some of the details here are when we were journey mapping, when you lose that connection and you're no longer able to find a safe exit from a protest because the internet has been shut down, and what you do in that situation. But some of the ways where we anticipated and mitigated against these traumatizing activities as design researchers was the attention that we paid to doing the same activities that we were asking our users to do, our people that we were researching ourselves as the project kind of leaders and the designers. So as an example, I did my own journey map of my experience with the Manchester arena bombing and what happened there, so that there was an understanding that there was commonality, or at least an attempt at understanding what it's like to experience a traumatizing activity. And all the researchers did this. I had to be very firm with quite a lot of the researchers and say we really can't be asking users to do something that we wouldn't be willing to do ourselves to better understand them. And eventually they all came around to doing their own examples of user journey mapping crises. So what I would ask you to do around working with traumatized high-risk users, so from a design research point of view, is if you can think of a deeply upsetting event in your life and begin to journey map this, then I would encourage you to. Don't do it if it's going to unnecessarily upset you. And it's not a competition about who could journey map the most traumatizing activity, but what it does do, whether or not you share this with anybody ever, what it does do is it helps you better understand the life cycle, the process that an upsetting, traumatizing event can be. And I've often had a lot of people listen to this talk and say, but I work on a website where we sell washer, fridge, dryers, where I work on a tool for banking. And they've done the exercise and realized that there are upsetting events that can be connected to any kind of activity in life, like the access to clean water is something that was explored with people that were working with this washer-dryer company and designing websites for buying that. And then a lot of financial poverty was something that people that worked in banking systems dug into when they did this activity. And just to kind of wrap up, because I think I've gone over time a little, the other ways that we made sure to do the work around peace building ethically with the researchers, where the researchers went through all the same processes, like the journey mapping, but all the other things that we did with these users, these communities, researchers did examples of themselves. The attendees of different workshops were notified prior to the workshops of all of the different subject matter. One of the hardest things for me to get approved was psychological support on site for the users when we're doing these kinds of activities. And again, you'll always be surprised with what kinds of things users find traumatizing in your work. So if you can talk to your organizations and companies about building a relationship with somebody that can offer psychological support to your user research participants, it's incredibly worth it. We had confidentiality of all the different content that people shared with us, and the researchers as well were supported post-workshop. So the researchers can experience things called vicarious trauma, which is when you experience trauma from secondhand from somebody else that is explaining a traumatic event. It happens a lot in crisis response and in a lot of different human rights work. If you're curious about vicarious trauma, there's some really great content out there by Medan, a company called Medan, M-E-E-D-A-N, mostly about how content moderators experience vicarious trauma when they're moderating offensive comments on different platforms, social platforms. But just to kind of give you places to find out more information about human rights-centered design, there is a community that there are a lot of different designers working in these NGOs and organizations hang out or write content for. There's some good stuff up there and places where people gather. hrcd.pubpub.org. And if people are curious about other ways to better understand different human rights and humanitarian kind of concerns within design, then you can always ask me where I go for my information online as opposed to my direct research. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. You can find me online here.